Welcome back, deep divers. Ever met someone who just seemed, larger than life? Today, we're diving into the story of a man who built a global movement from, well, pretty humble beginnings. Sun Myung Moon.
Hmm.
And we're not just retracing his steps, we're going deeper, using excerpts from Moon's own words, right alongside, like the biographical context, like we're holding a prism up to history,
Yeah.
How much of his life was shaped by the world he was born into versus his own vision?
It's a fascinating question, you're right, because Moon's life unfolds against a backdrop of just immense change. He's born in 1920, Korea under Japanese rule, tradition clashing with modernization.
Hmm.
Imagine the tension, the uncertainty in the air.
Yeah, okay, so already we're talking about like a recipe for someone to either cling to the old ways or become a revolutionary, right?
Exactly. And then layer onto that the importance of Confucian values in Korea at the time. Filial piety, respect for elders, helping those in need. These weren't just like suggestions. They were woven into the fabric of society.
Makes you wonder how much of that just seeped into Moon's worldview, right?
Right.
Even if subconsciously. And he writes about his family, especially his mother, with such reverence. It's really something.
Hmm.
There's this one line that really struck me. He says, "My mother never let a guest leave our home hungry, no matter how poor we were." I don't know, was that typical back then, or was Moon maybe idealizing things a bit?
It's certainly possible he's emphasizing that aspect, but you have to remember, hospitality was deeply ingrained in that culture. Think of it less like a choice and more like a societal obligation, almost, dare I say, a sacred duty.
Interesting. So we have this kid, right, growing up in this environment, already steeped in service and community, and then, bam, at 15 years old, he has this vision of Jesus.
Oh, wow.
And not just a, hey, I see you kind of vision, but one where Jesus actually tasks him with finishing this, like, incomplete mission. Can you imagine that? The pressure. What's your take on that?
Well, visions themselves aren't uncommon across religions, but it's the framing here that's really crucial. Moon presents this not just as some mystical experience, but a direct command from Jesus, a burden placed specifically on his shoulders.
Wow. You can almost feel the weight of that even now.
Yeah.
And it's not like things got any easier from there.
Yeah.
He ends up imprisoned in North Korea in the Hungnam labor camp, a place, well, let's just say it's a place synonymous with brutality.
Right.
So for our listeners who might not know, can you kind of paint a picture of what those camps were really like?
Sure. Imagine a place that's basically designed to strip away your humanity. Forced labor, starvation, disease is rampant, brutality is a constant threat. Survival. Just survival, that was the victory. Forget hope or faith. Even just existing in a place like that was a testament to the human spirit.
It's hard to fathom, even enduring that, let alone finding meaning in it. Yet, Moon claims this experience actually strengthened his faith. He writes, "Even in the darkest moments, I knew God was with me." Could you find solace in faith under those circumstances?
It's a question that's echoed through the ages, hasn't it? For some people, faith is the anchor in the storm. For others, it's shattered by suffering. Moon's experience, it speaks to the resilience of belief, or maybe just a way to cope with the unimaginable.
Yeah, it makes you think about that fine line between faith and just sheer willpower, right? And either way, he emerges from this experience even more convinced of this calling, his calling, to unify humanity,
Ah,
under God's love.
wow.
And this is where things get really interesting, because within a few years, he formally establishes the Unification Church. That name itself, unification, speaks volumes, don't you think?
Absolutely. I mean, it's 1954. The world's still reeling from World War II, divided by ideologies. And here's Moon, this man who's stared down, let's face it, unimaginable hardship. And he's preaching this message of universal love, of brotherhood.
Okay, but lots of religions preach love, preach unity. So what made Moon's message stand out, especially
No.
in that particular moment in history?
Well, I think you've got to remember, this isn't just some pie in the sky talk of peace and love. This is coming from someone who's lived through the horrors of a brutal labor camp, right? That personal experience, it lends an undeniable weight to his message, I think. It's like he's saying, look, I've seen the worst of humanity, and I'm telling you, there's a better way.
Yeah, it's like his credibility it's almost built into his biography in a way, right? Like, how do you even replicate that kind of authenticity?
Yeah.
And it takes off like wildfire, right? The small Korean movement, it explodes onto the global stage,
Right.
which, come on, we're talking pre-internet here, pre-easy travel even. So how does that even happen?
It's a testament to Moon's charisma, no doubt. But I also think it's about the way his message resonated with the anxieties of the time. the world, it was hungry for something to believe in, something that transcended all the political and ideological divides that, let's face it, seem to be threatening to tear it apart.
And he's not just talking the talk, right? He's creating a whole new model of living, a whole new way of being with the Unification Church.
And that's where some of the controversies come in, right? The mass weddings, the strict lifestyle guidelines.
Yeah, it's important to remember the cultural context here. I mean, in a lot of ways, Moon was challenging traditional Western notions of individualism.
Yeah.
He was proposing this, this system where the collective good, the ideal of a unified family, it superseded personal desires.
Which, let's be honest, is going to rub some people the wrong way, especially in more individualistic societies. Absolutely. But it also held a certain appeal for some, especially those who were, maybe they were seeking a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose in a world that was increasingly perceived as fragmented.
Yeah, it's that push and pull, right? The desire for belonging versus the need for individual expression. And in the Unification Church, that tension, it played out in a very public way.
It did.
I mean, critics, they pointed to the strict control, the demands for conformity as evidence of like a cult-like atmosphere. But then again, how much of that was simply a different cultural perspective, a different set of values at play?
Well, that's a question that, honestly, it continues to be debated even today. Were the mass weddings, for example, were they a form of coercion, or were they a radical expression of collective commitment to a shared ideal?
Mm-hmm.
Was the emphasis on obedience a form of mind control, or was it simply a different understanding of spiritual discipline? It's hard to say.
Yeah. Makes you wonder, how much can we truly judge a movement like this through our own cultural lens?
Yeah.
It's easy to look at it from the outside and just see the differences, the things that make us uncomfortable.
Right.
But what was it like to be on the inside, to find meaning and community in those shared beliefs, even if they came at a price? It's a question worth pondering.
Absolutely. And that's why I think it's so crucial to understand Moon's legacy, not just through the lens of controversy, but also through the experiences of those who were drawn to his message, who actually found solace and purpose within the Unification Church.
Because even after Moon's death in 2012, the movement continues. Right. Which, that begs the question, has it evolved with the times? Or has it stayed true to his original vision?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? On the surface, we see these efforts to, soften the edges,
Yeah.
to emphasize interfaith dialogue, social service.
A bit of a PR makeover, maybe?
Perhaps, but it's also possible that this reflects a genuine evolution within the church. Like a recognition that to remain relevant in the 21st century, it needs to adapt to a world that's very, very different from the one in which it was founded.
Right. It's like that old saying, the only constant is change. And that's true even for, institutions that, claim to have these eternal truths.
Yeah.
Speaking of truth, though, there's this one line from Moon towards the end of our excerpt that really stuck with me. He writes, "The life of faith isn't just what you believe, it's what you do with that belief." Powerful stuff.
It's that age-old debate, right? Faith versus works. And Moon, he lands pretty clearly on the side of action, putting belief into practice, even if those actions, even if they court controversy.
And that's what makes this deep dive so fascinating, I think.
Yeah.
Because it's easy to just dismiss someone, right? Based on headlines, sound bites, whatever.
Yeah.
But when you actually delve into their life story, hear their own words, you're kind of forced to confront the complexity there, the contradictions, really, that make up a human being. Yeah, no doubt.
And Sun Myung Moon, talk about contradictions. Here's a man who endured unimaginable suffering, yet he preaches this gospel of universal love. He builds this global movement, but at the same time sparks this intense debate about the very nature of faith and freedom.
Precisely. And I think that's the beauty of really engaging with stories like his. It forces us to ask these tough questions, grapple with the nuances, recognize that even in disagreement, there's still something to be learned.
So for our listeners, many of whom, might be encountering Sun Myung Moon for the first time today, what's the one thing you hope they take away from this whole deep dive?
I'd say don't be afraid to question. Don't be afraid to dig deeper, to challenge those preconceptions you have. Because the world is rarely black and white, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's understanding those shades of gray. That's where the real insight lies. Beautifully said. And on that note, we'll be sure to include links to all the excerpts we discussed in our show notes so you can continue your own exploration. Until next time, keep asking questions, keep diving deep. And as always, thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.